This is Audiovisual Cultures, the podcast that delves into topics and issues around cultural production. I'm the host and creator, Paula Blair. In this edition, I'm excited to be joined by film scholar Dr. Martha Shearer, talking about her research on musicals, women in New Hollywood, and much more. Thanks to our members on patreon.com/avcultures for your continued and valued support. If you'd like to help the podcast financially or by spreading the word, listen to the end to find out how. For now, do enjoy my chat with Martha amid the hustle and bustle of BFI South Bank in London.
I'm Martha Shearer and I'm currently teaching in the Department of Film Studies at King's College London, where I've worked for quite a while and I also did my PhD. I'm teaching a lot of sort of film history, contemporary film history, but also a lot of kind of Hollywood cinema and film noir and so on. Also, I'm currently editing 2 books.
Gosh, that's a big undertaking.
I know. Originally, they were sort of going to be not at the same time, and they sort of aren't. But there is definitely a point where in my life in the future where they will be overlapping that I'm just like, oh no. One of them's going to be on women and New Hollywood, and then the other one is called Musicals at the Margins, which is looking at films and media texts of various kinds that exist on the margins and boundaries of the musical as a genre, both historically and now, and especially now, I think, but also in a range of different kind of geographical contexts.
On the geographical context, you've worked a lot on New York,
yes.
New York City specifically. Yeah. Are you happy to tell us a bit about your research on that?
Yes. My first book was on the musical in New York City, and so what it was looking at was the fact that people, when they're writing about musicals, often talk about it as being about small towns or about kind of pastoral idylls or about fairy tale settings or faraway places, sort of everywhere that isn't the here and now. But actually, when you kind of go through the films that got made, which I tried to do to kind of trawl through the AFI catalogue and go through any film that was listed as a musical or go through loads of different kind of filmographies everywhere, and vast numbers of them are set in New York, and actually it's quite a primarily urban genre.
Okay.
And by far the most common setting across the genre overall is New York. So that I think was interesting, but also one of the primary things I was trying to do in that book was think about the ways in which New York was undergoing quite substantial amounts of change during the period at which the musical is at its peak. So from like the coming of sound in the late 1920s up to the sort of early 1960s really, which it starts to tail off from the kind of mid-50s. But this is when you're getting the kind of growth of suburbia. This is when you're getting various kinds of modernist architecture, you know, the baby boom, but there are also various processes of urban redevelopment that were completely transforming the city. And so I was interested in how that was sort of reshaping the musical and how those processes were registering the musical. And so it was a sort of project that was very confined into one city, but also because most of those musicals were still made in Los Angeles, so they're also almost always from the outside to some extent.
Right.
So it's trying to map on the relationship between the kind of industry and the process of production, the actual kind of aesthetics of the films themselves, and then their relationship to the history and geography of the city. Trying to kind of think about how all those things are woven together and transform each other throughout, from the very first musicals and go up until the 1970s. I didn't really consider anything contemporary in the book.
It's a really fascinating idea that New York is rebuilt on a studio lot somewhere in LA.
And MGM in particular, because they had a massive lot with lots of standing sets. So they had, I think, 3 different New York street sets, which you can pick up recurring again and again and again. They're like, oh, this is the Brownstone Street or whatever, and they'll slightly kind of redress them. So they have their own sort of approximation of the city. And so it is, to an extent, it's a different version of it. I was trying to kind of grapple with what is the relationship to the real city when you are constructing your own kind of weird, distorted version on another coast. But in order for it to make sense as New York, as a setting, it has to have some kind of relationship. It has to be responsive, even if that's not intentional. And so you can see the various ways in which these films are sort of responding to the actual kind of city, and especially because it's a musical and you continually suddenly have this influx of people working on Broadway. So there is this kind of direct, lived experience that people are actually drawing on there. But yeah, the sets are really interesting, and some, especially the historical musicals, where there's a whole cluster of musicals, especially in the 1940s, that are set around the turn of the century, which I have a whole chapter on. And a lot of them are doing quite interesting things where they're trying to present this vision of the city and the skyline and the actual buildings that doesn't really exist anymore because it's all been rebuilt. And so the ways in which they're visually attracted to kind of these different forms of New York that exist or have existed, and how they can use those as forms of spectacle.
We can maybe talk about some examples of specific films in a minute. I'm just wondering about New York as a transient space, because there's so much immigration to America coming in, especially if a lot of the films are earlier in the 20th century.
Yeah.
And then people moving, the way they're moving through them, it's not just singing, it's dance we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think musicals are really preoccupied with people coming to the city, but not necessarily as migrants. So there is a kind of standard musical narrative where it's like a small-town girl comes and she wants to be a star on Broadway, and she ends up living in a boarding house and having lots of fun with her boarding house friends. But actually, there's relatively little on contemporary migration, whether that's from the South, which there was kind of a second great migration that happened around World War II, or actual immigration, which is strange in a lot of ways. I mean, there are a couple of historical musicals that have Irish immigrants, but that is the kind of, I don't know, acceptable form of whiteness, I think. This very romanticised vision of Irishness, especially in 1940s musicals. They will have weird Gene Kelly doing a jig, but that's okay. There's a film called Up in Central Park, which has Vincent Price playing Boss Tweed, who was this big political powerhouse, I suppose, and controlling Tammany Hall. It's about his downfall in this very, very fictionalised version, but it's all about these father and daughter Irish immigrants, literally fresh off the boat, get picked up by this guy working for Tammany Hall, and it's like, oh, you have to go and vote 23 times. And they're like, okay, because we can't read, so we don't understand the Constitution. Then they learn how to read, and they're like, oh no. What's interesting, I think, is that the musicals are much less interested in that sense of transience than in the sense of fixity. So they're really preoccupied with these very dense neighbourhoods where, everyone knows each other, and actually they might be quite ethnically diverse, and you will have Italians there, and you will have people from Eastern Europe, and they're all living together, and they're all have their own customs or whatever, but it's really interested in this fixed, dense idea of a neighbourhood. And so a lot of the films in the 1940s, because there were all these plans to redevelop them, to build new public housing, or to move people out the city because they want to build an arts centre or whatever, there's a real sense of anxiety to those kinds of films. And so what those musicals end up being about is this sense of community that's really rooted in place. So it's actually much less about embracing that sense of transience and change and people moving in and out. They're really worried about the ways that these neighbourhoods and the city as a whole might change. It's quite defensive mode in a lot of ways. And actually I think the kind of historical musicals are doing something similar, because they're setting up this idea of continuity with the past. And quite often, even though they're displaying the ways in which the skyline might have changed, they're quite often built around places that still exist. So you have set around Central Park. There's a whole scandal in that film about Boss Tweed rearing the animals in the Central Park Zoo for him to eat, or Washington Square Park, but stuff that still exists. So it's about a sense of continuity that's threatened, and they're quite disdainful of any kind of modernism as well, especially once you get in the 1950s and you get proper kind of international style skyscrapers. These don't go down very well. They're not interested in the glamour of that, especially.
Wow, I have missed out on a lot of stuff.
The thing is, a lot of these films, I ended up, because I was doing this database, and I had this mad spreadsheet where I was going through the AFI catalogue, listing any film listed as a musical or a film with songs, which is a different category in the way it starts to get a bit unstable, but also going through all these kind of coffee table books that got produced in the 70s and just going through every single film they listed, so that I had this master list of anything that might be considered a musical that was being produced from the 30s to the 60s. it's vast, like the numbers are absolutely vast. And so I was going through and trying to be like, okay, what proportion of these films are set in New York and what trends can I pick out? It took months, absolutely months just doing that, but it threw up some interesting things that I think get missed because the musical is a genre that people are very familiar with, the same sort of like 15 to 20 films that get talked about constantly and get screened constantly, but there are, 800 other films, and some of them are doing similar things to those films. In some ways those films are kind of exceptional and that's why they're interesting, but actually there are these broad themes that get really lost if you're just going to the films that you know. That is one of the things that I've really wanted to do with genre studies, really, is to try and bring in some of the things that actually were tapping into quite significant trends in the genre but have got lost somewhere because of the process of canonization. So sometimes I'll be talking about films and people will be like, yeah, I know that film. I'm like, you absolutely don't. Like, I found it in this list, and then like the only way I could see it was because its child star was selling a copy on her like weird personal website. Yeah, that was an amazing find, that film. But it did come, like the DVD came and it was just some like DVD-R, and it didn't even have the title of the film on it, just like her name and then a big picture of her.
Really?
And so
It's like, was it a homemade almost sort of thing?
Yeah. But I was very grateful to that because, it really wasn't available anywhere else. It never will be, probably. I mean, there's...
And so what film is that?
This was called There's a Girl in My Heart.
Aww.
And that was another turn of the century musical about a kind of neighbourhood where they all club together and put on a show or whatever. And there's various kinds of roller skating people and all this kind of stuff. It's about a block that was threatened with redevelopment, so it's quite interesting for my purposes because it's really keying into key urban things. So it's not a very good film and it's very cheaply made. It's like a Poverty Row musical when there are various Poverty Row studios that wanted to go a bit more middle brow and so started making musicals to do that, which are a bit more expensive than the things they would normally be doing. But I mean, it's really chunky. There are bits when I'm watching it and I'm like, I feel like that bit of set is falling down.
Wow.
So it's not like I'm providing this, but like, everyone please check out this amazing piece of cinema arts that you have missed. But it is, for thinking about the relationship between the musical and New York and between Hollywood cinema and New York, it is quite an interesting example because it's directly talking about the redevelopment to like build a sports arena, I think, in that case. Right. It's quite interesting that those films that are completely very, very cheap and they were reasonably widely distributed, but no one was really paying particular attention to them, but are actually kind of engaging with these films really directly. It's quite interesting.
Wow. Just because it might be objectively not well made, it doesn't mean it can't teach us anything, which you're showing,
Yeah, and I think actually some of those films, you don't have to be... I'm not really ever particularly interested in whether the films are good.
Yeah, that doesn't matter.
Yeah, whereas I think other sorts of projects, that's maybe part of your argument in that, I don't know, or that you're saying that this film is engaging with, or making an interesting intervention, or doing this in quite a sophisticated way, but I was totally uninterested in that sort of...
Yeah, it's different kind of value.
Yeah.
I suppose if that maybe would raise the question is, well, how do we define a musical then? Like, if there are these leakages with other types of films that are not quite musicals, but we don't know if they're musical enough, how do you define...
This is the kind of stuff I'm working on at the moment. So I'm editing this book, Musicals at the Margins, with Julie Labelzo-Wright, and this is sort of the starting point, really, in that I think there is a sense that it's really obvious what a musical is. But I have this with students every year when I try to teach this, where they're really like, well, a musical, it has to be when like people are breaking into song, and any film where there are only stage performances, that can't be a musical. Any film where people are just dancing and not singing, that's not a musical. And like, let me give you like a list of films and a list of contexts in which people have definitely considered them musicals, and it actually is much more unstable than it initially appears, and especially if you move beyond the canon, and especially actually if you're talking about a more contemporary context, because there does come a point around the late 70s, early 80s where the genre really does start to shift and develop into dance film cycles. What we've wanted to completely sidestep are those boundary policing issues, because what it's doing is it's a way of managing that instability rather than actually acknowledging it and addressing it. And so what we're trying to do with this Musicals at the Margins project is directly look at the unstable edges and look at those films that might be boundary cases or that have been marginalised. So there are examples of films where no one would really dispute the fact that they're musicals, but they haven't been discussed as such for various kinds of reasons, or perhaps because they're dealing with marginalised groups, or they're in a marginal cinema, or they're doing something slightly different, or they're not a film, or they're like a short film, or all these kinds of things, where to put those kind of questions front and centre. I think with the book, my approach was really, I'm not going to impose a definition. I'm going to be really led by, and actually some of the films that I wrote about, their generic status was contested at the time. The example I always have is this film Young Man with a Horn, which is about Kirk Douglas playing a jazz trumpeter. It's great. But that is a film that's really interesting because when I looked at the memos in the archive, you get all these people writing about it being like, just to be clear everyone, this is not a musical. This is a very serious drama about jazz.
Because it can't be a musical.
So it's not a musical, just to be clear, it's not a musical.
Okay.
But they also cast Doris Day as a singer in it. And it's very early in her film career, but she was a singer already at that point. But when it gets released, there are various reviews that come out that are just like, oh yes, this new musical, blah, 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 just in this offhand way. And so the studio can't really, or the people working on that film, can't actually control how other people understand it. That film now doesn't really get discussed very often as a musical. It gets discussed quite a lot, and it's been written about extensively as a jazz film. But there's some sort of resistance towards understanding it as a jazz musical. These things are never really settled, and I think even with the studio era, where it seems like it ought to be much more clear-cut what a musical is, there are various kinds of films where some people will categorise them as a musical, others will be like, no, this is a drama that just has a few bits of singing in it, just has an occasional musical number, it's not a musical. So it's never really clear, actually, and that in itself is something that's sort of interesting, and it does make it a bit more difficult, and it puts the ways in which the genre has been theorised under some pressure, because, you know, there are various examples of books written in the 80s where they have a list of criteria that a musical has to meet in order for it to be considered a musical. It's really, you get some quite strange exclusions. So there's a passage in like Rick Altman's book on the musical where one of his key arguments is that the musical is always built around the formation of a heterosexual couple, and it's necessarily structured by it. And so he gets to a point where he's like, oh, you know, there are various films that don't meet that, like The Wizard of Oz, which you would obviously consider to be a musical. And so he does this weird sort of like dance around it, where he's like, oh, you know, maybe that's a musical, but it's also something different, it's like a children's film. So he sort of includes it in his list of musicals, but then he's like, this doesn't fit my definition, so I'm going to say it's something else. And like children's musicals are like a different thing. This is really weird.
He's the gatekeeper.
Yeah,
of what
so
a musical
he's
is.
like,
wow.
yeah, it's strange because actually a lot of the ways in which he's writing about genre theory in that book are really interesting and really useful and are quite flexible and quite open, and then takes this strange turn, which is always quite fun to teach, but it does throw up the ways in which any sort of definition you're immediately going to run into trouble, because there will always be these boundary cases that are going to throw up problems. And
I do like a troubling border, I have to say.
Yeah. yes, another troubled border. Yeah, I mean, I think in my first book I did what a lot of people do, which is just like, I'm not really going to deal with this, I'm just going to have quite an open and pragmatic approach, which I think was the right thing for that book, because it wasn't really about definition, but it was something that stayed with me, and so I think that's one of the reasons why I've ended up doing this project, where it's really putting that at the forefront.
Okay, that sounds fascinating. I mean, surely film was always musical in the sense that there would have been live scores playing in silent films a lot of times. So technically, a lot of those films come from musicals in that sense.
Yeah, well, this is the thing when it starts becoming all-encompassing.
That's too big then, is it?
Well, I think that's quite an interesting question because, and various of our contributors, because we're just getting the chapters in now to read, have gone at this from different angles. Because you can look at what is the genre, how have people understood it, and how has that been different at different times, how has it been contested, how might that have changed? So that more sort of cultural approach. And then other people are picking things, I mean, like, these films don't get talked about as musicals or get talked about in relation to the musicals, but actually aesthetically, they're doing similar things to fairly canonical examples of the musical. But then you could also take that much broader approach and be like, this is on a continuum with the ways in which music is incorporated in film and the ways in which that might be spectacularised. And I think one of the interesting things is that you can look at the musical and it gets used as a kind of analogy in other kinds of genre studies. So Linda Williams, for example, at length compares hardcore pornography to the musical, the same use of kind of numbers and climax and all this kind of stuff. Or people will compare action films to musicals and their use of bodily spectacle that's built around music and stuff like that. Or in the 80s, when you start getting all these kind of synergistic films that are really built around their soundtracks, that is doing something similar to a musical, except it's all non-diegetic music quite a lot of the time. So once you start thinking in that way, it starts becoming something really broad and really opens it out. Genre studies so often siloed, so that you have people working on this little kind of genre and this little genre in ways that don't really speak to each other as much as they might. So you get people writing books on comedy, and I'll read them and I'm like, oh yeah, those films are also talked about as musicals, but you're not cross-referencing each other, you're just speaking in these strange little lanes. And so it starts to become something that can really be a lot more open.
So I jotted down a load of your publications just to give me a few prompts. I thought this US-UK romances thing, this transatlantic thing, sounded quite interesting.
This was something that came out of a conference at Roehampton a few years back. It's looking like it's going to be quite an interesting project because some of the stuff is on film, some of it's on literature, some of it's on politics. I've been doing a few projects recently on gentrification, and this is going to be part of a bigger project I'll get onto at some point on real estate in contemporary film and television.
Oh, right.
But anyway, so this project is less about that and more directly about gentrification and television. So I'm looking at 2 TV shows looking in You're the Worst that both include US-UK romances in gentrifying cities and gentrifying areas of those cities, and how those class issues get played out, because quite often they'll use British characters as bearers of class identity in quite interesting ways. And Looking, I think, is a really interesting example because Andrew Haig's was kind of directed a lot of it, and Russell Tovey is in it.
Russell Tovey.
But what is really interesting about it is, so there is a way in which that show, because it has British people involved creatively, it gets it, I think, more than other kind of examples. There's this really interesting running thing where Jonathan Groff's character can't read his Britishness. He's talking about where he grew up in Essex, and then Jonathan Groff is like, oh, that sounds really leafy, I'm imagining Wimbledon, and well, this is exactly it. So if you have any kind of familiarity with what he's talking about, you would laugh. And when I've shown that, I kind of know everyone's kind of, whereas it's sort of interesting who that joke is for. I think there's something interesting with the way in which those programmes will connect this idea of Britishness with a class system and present, and then this gentrification that the city's undergoing is this class transformation of their cities, and how those sorts of things are used to kind of speak to each other. And I think Looking does that in an actually fairly interesting way. The other TV show I'm talking about, You're the Worst, which I have not seen the last 2 seasons of because it's quite difficult to watch in this country. There were various little bits of it that got shown on Channel 5 at one point. I think it's actually a bit more troubling, and it has this idea of some sort of international creative class which allows you to escape your class background. And it has this actually fairly pernicious, I think, undercurrent of where it has this very unconvincing British character who is supposed to have grown up in the rough part of Manchester, as he puts it. The actor comes from Cambridge, and he has this really posh accent, and you're like, what's happening here?
No, I don't think so.
There's this whole thing where his working class abusive father, who he hates, and the show expects you to hate, sends him a football shirt for the team that the dad supports and the son has never been interested in, which is Manchester football team.
Oh, right.
You know Manchester football team. You're sort of watching this going, what's happening here? I don't understand what's going on. So it's sort of tone deaf in that way, but also it has this weird international hipster class transcendence idea, which I think is a lot of ways kind of quite distastefully handled.
I suppose for anybody who might, because for me this would be a reference point, is it better or worse than Jane Leaves's Mancunian accent in Frasier?
Well, he doesn't even try doing one.
Seriously?
Yeah, no, he's just like a posh southerner. It's ridiculous. Wow. And then his whole supposedly Mancunian family come to visit, and they all have different regional accents. Right. It's very confusing. That episode was a stressful watch. There are things about this show that I really like, but this is upsetting. But yeah, I've been trying to branch out from New York because
yeah.
those shows, one of them is set in LA and one of them is San Francisco. So I've gone from like doing this long immersion in New York and its history to now I feel like I'm dotting about, writing about various other different cities, which requires me to try and figure out the things that are happening in those places, which is a different skill. But
yeah, because you're not just researching the cultural products, it's the geography, geopolitics, the culture of these places. They're like microcosms of whatever other things
it does make my life harder. And I think this is the stress and anxiety of interdisciplinarity, where you're trying to keep on top of multiple objects, which is, you know, the city and the actual texts, but also at the same time trying to vaguely keep on top of different disciplines. And it's a lot of work. I think it's really hard to do it well, and I don't necessarily feel like I do it well all the time. I think it's something that
everybody can only do what they can do.
And I think it's useful to sort of be aware of that. Also, because I feel like I go to a lot of film and X conferences, where you'll get film studies people being like, "I'm so sorry, I am a film and media scholar. I don't know anything. I just want to apologise before I give my paper." And then the number of times I've been at those conferences where people from other disciplines, just anyone, feels completely comfortable talking about film.
Oh, I know.
I have to be being like, you know, there's a whole discipline.
It's too massive. Because that's the thing. It's like we know our tiny bit of it.
Yeah.
And we know a bit about other bits of it. But it's massive. It's more massive than a lot of people think because it's everything. It does bleed into all these other disciplines.
There used to be a point where I would be at this company like really annoyed by that. Be like, why haven't you read this book? And I'm like, it is really difficult to get a handle on what other disciplines are doing. I mean, that's not to say we shouldn't do it though. I think it's really productive and I think it throws up really interesting work, but it is hard to sort of try and get those multiple disciplines to speak to each other and to corral those different things into one project. So yeah, it's a thing I'm constantly like, am I doing this properly? Have I missed some big debates that I'm not aware of and I'm stepping on someone's toes somewhere?
It's just part of the imposter syndrome. That's everybody. Most people have.
Some people don't. So I always feel like the people who really need to have imposter syndrome are the ones who don't.
But no, if you're questioning yourself, those are good questions because they'll keep you hopefully on the straight and narrow. Because I mean, you're making inquiry into, it sounds like very uncharted territories in terms of trying to tease out what are the boundaries of this and do there have to be. And a lot of people don't really like. A lot of people like closed boxes and pigeonholes for things and labels for things. And we're in a world at the minute where, in many ways, we're challenging that. We're challenging that with gender, with sexuality, with geopolitics, you know, all the time. So it feels like it's a moment where there's anxiety in some camps about things need to be bordered off because I need to know what my identity is.
Yes, and I want to have a very fixed sense of it and to defend that, and that's what I'm.
There's a resistance to fluidity in a way. So no, I completely appreciate that because my own studies have been about the fault lines and where the slippages between things, you know, between what kind of media it is and what kind of place is it, what's the identity of whoever's behind it, you know. So completely sympathise, but any question that's niggling at you, it must be useful because then you can really make sure you're not doing those things.
I think it's always useful to pay attention to those questions.
For sure.
It's giving you important information, I think.
Yeah, and in a way you have to, even when you don't want to have boundaries, you need to sort of in a way set your own boundaries because you drive yourself mad. It's the archive fever.
I know, this is when everything starts to become unwieldy. There's in like Don DeLillo's Libra, it's like a historian character who is just never finishing the project, just surrounded by paper and by notes and everything. I'm like, I thought about that a lot during my PhD. It's the perfect sort of metaphor.
It's not that it's over, it just has to have a stopping point, you know, that's how it is.
And a lot of the times the stoppage point is just the tyranny of the word count.
You need something to rein it in, you know, and isn't it exciting that there's potential that other people take on the baton, other people in a few years' time might go, actually Martha identified this, but maybe actually this might be the case, and then you have a conversation about it, you know, and that's quite exciting in a way. And
that's the dream.
Hopefully, that's maybe in an idealist again. Haven't learnt anything. Do you have a favourite topic in terms of your musical stuff, or is it bigger than that? Are you done with it yet? Are you bored?
It's interesting because I sort of wrote the book and then I was like, oh, I'm done with music. And then I've ended up with this other project. But I'm sort of, especially also because now the BFI is having this massive musical season, so I'm like, oh, I have to put my musicals hat back on again and stuff I want to see. But I'm working the chapter for the musicals edited book. I'm writing about the Magic Mike films.
Oh, right, okay.
So that's coming at it from a slightly different angle.
So you are doing contemporary stuff?
Yeah, it's mainly contemporary stuff I'm doing at the moment. And then I have another project that I'm working on for another collection on musical that's going to be on Xanadu. Yeah, I'm going to try and write 10,000 words about Xanadu and we'll see how that goes. I think the thing is that once you do something, then people start asking you to do stuff along those lines again, which is nice. And some of the time you're like, yes, actually there is a kind of thing I still want to do. And then at some point you have to be like, I have to stop and I have to move on to the next project or I'm going to go mad. So yeah, I think after this I'm going to try and put some lines down and start working on.
You also don't want to be typecast as the musical person.
There are plenty of people who've gone through that, who are like, their whole identity as a scholar is like the musicals person, whatever. And that's great. But I think there are some people who want to basically be working on the same thing for, if not their entire career, then a really extended portion of it. And I think I got to a point where I was like, I'm done with this. I think I still have these questions that are lingering that I want to kind of push in this direction. Or I think definitely the work I've done recently that's not directly on the musical, it has been a product of the concerns that I've been working on about the relationship between film and cities, but pushing it in a slightly different direction because I really wanted to have that sense of some kind of a break. I think especially when you've written a book based on your PhD.
You need to move away for a bit at least.
Work on one thing for like such a long time. Yeah. I mean, it was most of a decade.
Yeah.
And I was just like, do you need to have fresh, new things?
Even like a break from it and go back and do something else later. But yeah, you do need that distance because I suppose it's like having a really close family member. You know, I love you, but I need a break from you. For my sanity.
It's funny, when you're kind of like, okay, I can do this amount of time, and then I need to go. Yeah.
Just one more question about the because I saw you worked on something to do with Suspiria.
Yes, which actually is a kind of a total break with all that kind of stuff. So this is actually because I'm doing this Women in New Hollywood book. I mean, I'd worked on New Hollywood in the kind of musicals project, so I sort of had that connection to it. But I'm co-editing it with Aaron Hunter, who's done a lot of work on this. But I got asked whether I'd be interested in submitting a proposal for this edited collection of Women Make Horror. I'd been teaching Suspiria because I love Suspiria, and I think it's a great, very teachable film, kind of doing interesting things formally, but also has this fairy tale quality that's kind of great. And my project on that is about Daria Nicolodi as its screenwriter. Firstly, looking at the ways in which she's sort of been marginalised in a lot of the writing about it, whether that's fan writing or scholarship, because it's seen overwhelmingly as an Argento film. But also just looking at and thinking about what happens when we understand this film as having a female author. And I think doing that throws up some quite interesting things about it in the ways that it's actually quite interested in questions of authorship. It's setting up all these deaths which are irrational and unexplainable. That is a question of authorship, like who was responsible for this, who created it, and how did they do it, and it ends up being women. I mean, there's two, I think, very peripheral male characters in that film. It's also like got a very feminine aesthetic. It's very what Rosalind Galt talks about as pretty, and it's about witches and ballet. I think there is a way of reading it as engaging with certain kinds of questions of female authorship. That aspect of the text gets really, you can't see that if you're purely seeing it as Dario Argento. It was really nice to do that project actually, because it also allowed me to go back to some of the stuff I was really interested in at undergrad, feminist film theory, and to kind of reread some of those texts and things about how they might relate to that. It was a really nice break, but it was also one of these things where I'm like, oh god, I'm working on this like cult film that all these horror nerds love, oh, they're going to find these holes in it, and I was like, no, it was really nice because it's a film that has, I did realise it was basically, of all the horror films I could have chosen, the one that's most like a musical without being one.
It's a great way of looking looking at it.
This is what I realised eventually when I was sort of like, no, this is completely different from the other kinds of research that I've been doing, and so it's really nice, refreshing.
One of the coolest cinematic experiences I've ever had was at the Belfast Film Festival one year. Goblin came over and did a live score with Suspiria.
I'd love to.
So good. Yeah. So good. It was awesome. And it was me and a friend who's Italian and works in Italian cinema. Like, it was us and a bunch of dudes, mostly.
Yeah.
Like a bunch of very dudes.
Oh my god.
In metal t-shirts and stuff. There for Goblin, and we're like,
oh wow,
we're here for the movie.
Yeah. There is some quite interesting work on Suspiria as a film that has like a disproportionately high female fandom as compared to like other Argento films or other Italian horror films or whatever. There's quite interesting female following to that film.
But it was really amazing to see it with that live score. I can't really watch it again because it's a bit. It's playing it for me now. It's that liveness. There's just something about it, Do you want to talk a bit about the women in New Hollywood?
Yeah.
Again, it's uncharted territories because anybody who knows anything about New Hollywood, it's a very male, angry man-centered new wave type movement.
Exactly. The scholarship is still really attached to that auteurist male sort of like, oh, I am this great romantic artist, sort of like, look at me bucking the system.
I'm so much to be angry about.
Which is really tedious. But also there are various women who direct film in this period. And there's actually a really interesting book that's come out recently called Liberating Hollywood by Maya Smigler, which is about each of the women who directed films in the New Hollywood period, including people that are relatively well known, like Elaine May, to other people who are less familiar. But I think one of the things we really wanted to do with this project is not just look at directors, because I think one of the real problems is that that period has been understood in such an auteurist way that has obscured paying attention to the women that were working in other kinds of creative roles. So whether that's as screenwriters, as production designers, as editors especially, or as camera operators, or all this kind of thing. So we have a really interesting mix of people working on directors like Barbara Loden, and two people working on Lee Brackett or Marsha Lucas and people like that. So there's a chapter on Maya Angelou's efforts to kind of make a film. We've also tried to organise it in a way that we have sections there's a section that's primarily dealing with looking at the industry and historiography and looking at that side of things. A section that's more focused on how that creative labour shaped texts, so actually looking about how we can see women's contributions to the films, and then also a section looking at theory. There doesn't tend to be that contact a lot of the time between the thinking about theory and thinking about the industry, but hopefully there'll be some interesting work there that's thinking about the generation of theory in the period in relation to those films, but also thinking historiographically about the emergence of feminist film theory, or about the kinds of film criticism that are going on at the time, but also about how we might think theoretically about women's authorship in that period in various different capacities. So it's really exciting, but it's also at that early stage where we've got the proposal and we're now just getting contributors in. I think it's going to be really exciting, but it's also editor collections, man, are just like they're hard. Yeah,
I've been working on one as an editor and no, never again.
This is what everyone says to me, like, oh my god, why am I doing two? I mean, it's really kind of, when I've been a contributor, there have been times where I'm like, oh, it's term time, I'm really sorry to be late with my chapter, and then you're like, that's fine, but it's also like you're trying to manage lots of other different people's various commitments, and then trying to get everything on schedule and sort of trying to herd cattle.
But it sounds like it'd be worth it, and it should bring together a lot of new voices on the topic.
I think we've got quite an interesting range of people that are contributing to it, and I do think it really is. There have been a lot of kind of books that have come out on New Hollywood recently, and I think this is making a sort of necessary intervention in the field, I think, which is really in need of some feminist scholarship. Jostle some of that forward. They're hard work, but it's something I do really enjoy reading other people's work and getting able to ask those questions and help them work with it, and I'm really delighted to be part of this. I think it's doing something necessary. I think it's really important that edited collections, because there are so many of them, it's just continually creating edited collections, that they actually have an actual project and aren't just collections of stuff. And I do think this is kind of a really vital project in a lot of ways.
Yeah, there's an important agenda behind it. There's a network now of this kind of thing, and more broadly with the Calling the Shots project.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really hot area, I think. And,
definitely. Yeah.
You know, in a lot of ways, we've been slow in film studies to get to this point, but there are so many really interesting projects of this nature that are going on at the moment. So it's like a really good time to be doing this sort of work.
It feels like all of your projects, it's all the lads, you've had these lovely favourites for a while, but actually all this other stuff, it's like the iceberg metaphor, 9/10 under, you know, there's just all this, such a vast range of other work going on that's not valued, and whether it's because it just wasn't very good, or it didn't get a lot of funding, or people just deliberately kept things out of histories, or kept people out of work, or just didn't acknowledge labour in some way. Yeah. You know, it's almost like archaeology happening. There's this digging out of what actually happened.
Yeah. I think with New Hollywood it's interesting because there's long been this cliche being like, oh, you know, New Hollywood is a critical construction, but it sort of becomes so clear how it's a critical construction that's constructed around white masculinity. Yeah. And like whether it's acknowledged or not, that is one of the attractions of it. And I think the films are more interesting than that. But the borders of that category are constructed in such a way as to exclude. I mean, and then also you do need to think about it slightly differently when you're talking about women, because a lot of those women, they didn't want to work in Hollywood because of what it was, you know, entirely reasonably, or they wanted to and their pathways were just blocked and never got to make those jumps in a way that a man in an equivalent position would have been able to. So it does require thinking about that concept in a different way. It's both a kind of excavation and a reframing, I think, that excavation kind of requires really in order to be comprehensible. Why am I working on so many different things at the same time?
Because you're interested in those different things.
I know. This is why I'm so exhausted this summer, is because I'm like really kind of sat down at one point a few weeks ago and I was like, I am trying to think about 5 different things at the same time, and sometimes I'll be reading a book and I'll be like, oh, this is really useful for this, but wait, I was reading this for this project and now I'm like, I just have to kind of
that's what it's like. You know, that's what it is to be a nerd.
Yeah, basically, this is what I've done to myself. I mean, it's all self-inflicted. It's
it just sounds like you've got really exciting stuff going on. That's really fab. Thank you. Do you want to direct anybody to your websites to find out more about any of these projects?
Yeah, so my book is out and is incredibly expensive, but you know, I'm sure parts of it are on Google Books if you're especially interested. I think my most recent publication was in the Oxford Handbook of Musical Theatre Screen Adaptations, which is an enormous book. Those Oxford handbooks are always absolutely doorstop things. I got to write about some stuff that was in my PhD that didn't make it into the book, so it was sort of the last dregs that kind of... so that was...
Dregs you're calling it? And that's probably something really class.
So it was actually... I mean, I wrote about On the Town a bit in the book, but I had to cut it down because I'd written so much about it in my PhD that it slightly derailed one of my chapters because there's so much to say about it. So I cut a load of it out and then put it in this chapter, and so I was like, oh, yeah, finally I have a place for this. And then another film that I absolutely love called Bells Are Ringing, which doesn't get talked about so much but is wonderful, with Judy Holliday, who isn't so well known because she died very young and died in the 60s before she got to talk herself up in the 70s when all the other Hollywood stars were doing that talk show circuit. She's less well known, but she's amazing, and it's an absolutely lovely film about she works as a kind of answer phone operator. It's a hard plot to explain, but basically the chapter is about how those two films, which are both adaptations of Broadway musicals, but also the ways in which they're adapting New York, and the ways in which New York is itself changing, and that requires an adaptation of representational strategies. It was really nice to be able to write about those two films that I'd had to, for structural reasons, not talk about so much in the book, and just expand that and kind of really delve into it. I don't really have a personal website or anything like that, so I deleted academia.edu for ethical reasons.
Me too.
But I have a page on the King's website at the moment, so that exists.
Yeah, I'll direct people to that on the socials.
The socials.
The socials. Can't thank you enough for doing this. It's been really
thank you for
lovely.
having me. It's nice,
My first ever visit to the BFI South Point.
Yeah, that's very exciting in itself. All these ambient announcements.
Yeah.
No, but it's also, the thematic setting for...
Yeah, makes sense. Because usually when I do this sort of thing, it's in the Tyneside cinema. And
yeah.
I feel very fancy today.
Oh, I know. This is sort of where I will have a coffee break when I'm working in the BFI library. So it's kind of quite nice for that. You can just sit here.
You've been listening to Audiovisual Cultures with me, Paula Blair, and my very special guest, Martha Shearer. This episode was recorded and edited by Paula Blair, and the music is Common Ground by Airtone, licensed under Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 and available for download from ccmixter.org. If you like the show and find its contents useful and interesting, please help cover production and distribution costs by donating to paypal.me/PEA Blair or liberapay.com/PEA Blair. Episodes are released every other Wednesday. Please rate, share and subscribe on your chosen listening platform as this helps others find the show. For more information, visit audiovisualcultures.wordpress.com and follow AV Cultures on Twitter and Facebook. Thanks so much for listening and catch you next time.